What treasures does the Age of Steam Roundhouse hold? Today on the Roundhouse, we're going to open the doors. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to The Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozerak, and this is episode number 82 of our Trains and Railroad podcast, where we're talking about everything in the railroad industry and hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today, we are getting to something I've wanted to talk about pretty much since day one of this show. That is the Age of Steam Roundhouse. We are talking specifically with Noel Poirier, who is the Executive Director of the Roundhouse. But we're going to be taking a look at this amazing steam locomotive collection that was amassed by the late Jerry Joe Jacobson, and this vision that is very unique in the field of rail preservation, to build a roundhouse from scratch, model it after the roundhouses of yesteryear, and house this gigantic steam locomotive collection inside it. This is really an amazing feat, and I'm glad we get to talk about the Roundhouse on the Roundhouse. In fact, I've actually had people occasionally email the show, the Roundhouse, saying, hey, when are you guys open? And then I realized that they're talking about this Roundhouse. So it's good that we get this opportunity for the Roundhouses to meet. Before we get to that, though, I have an interesting piece of news to share with you, and this actually comes from my hometown of Meadville. The French Creek Valley Railroad Historical Society has purchased an original Bessemer and Lake Erie train station that was built in 1881. For many years, up until recent history, it was a feed store, and now it has been purchased with the vision of making it a railroad education center. Now, full disclosure and bias, I am on the board of the French Creek Valley Railroad Historical Society, so I have specific reason to be particularly chuffed about this. But for us to have a building that we can use for programming, for educating the public about trains and railroads, bringing them into the hobby, this is going to be massive. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out meadvillerailroaddepot.com. I'll have a link in the show notes. If you think it sounds cool, any financial donation that you can make toward it would be absolutely appreciated. If you want to learn more, meadvillerailroaddepot.com. Our guest today is involved with one of the youngest roundhouses that you're probably going to find, at least in North America, if not the world. He is the Executive Director of the Age of Steam Roundhouse. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Noel Poirier.
Thanks, Nick. How
did you first become aware of the existence of the Age of Steam Roundhouse?
Well, that's a good question. I've been working at another museum for a while, and was reached out to by a consultant who was looking at helping the Roundhouse find an executive director to kind of guide it through its kind of infancy and as it kind of transitioned from a private collection to a public entity as a museum. And it was interesting. And what attracts me and what attracted me to every museum I've ever worked for is the quality of the collection and the quality of the stories that we can tell with the collection. And really on first look at the Age of Steam Roundhouse's collection and what was there, at the scope of what was there and the scope of the stories that we could tell with what was there, it was pretty much a no-brainer for me to seriously consider it as an opportunity.
How did that collection initially form?
You know, it's interesting. Our founder is Jerry Joe Jacobson, and of course in the rail fan world, you know, he's fairly well known. And Jerry was a physician, a trained physician, But my favorite story about Jerry and where the collection really, has its beginning is when he was a young boy living in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, right towards the tail end of the steam era. And Jerry would be riding his bike along the tracks, and he'd see these B&O steamers go by. And there's this great story that one of his friends tells me about how, he would just stop his bike and just stare there and watch those trains go by all day. And I think that's where the collection started. It started in Jerry's, young mind, and that desire to do that. The challenge for someone like Jerry or for anybody is that if you want to own steam locomotives, you essentially have to own a railroad. And so Jerry spent a career in the medical field, to the point where he was in a position to buy a railroad in 1988. He bought a railroad called the Ohio and called it the Ohio Central, which was actually ran right past where the Roundhouse is today, actually, and began the acquisition of locomotives and other railroads, and really became kind of a real mover and shaker in the business. And over 20 years, was able, to accumulate steam locomotives, diesel locomotives, rolling stock, until he eventually sold his railroad to Genesee and Wyoming, and really the formation of the Roundhouse kind of started.
What do you think inspired him to go about this massive undertaking? So you talked about his childhood development, but that flame still stuck with him. And just the challenges associated with building a modern roundhouse. I mean, how does one tackle something like that?
Yeah, and it's not even just building a modern roundhouse. It's you need to have it in a set location where you can get to it. You need, and Jerry's vision was unique in that he didn't just want a roundhouse. He wanted a roundhouse of a particular era. He wanted a roundhouse that represented kind of really the height of the steam, era. So that's really what he was after, and that required really an enormous amount of research. I mean, Jerry was very lucky to have incredibly talented people around him, and always has, who did a lot of research on roundhouses, came up with plans for the roundhouse. Moved it all together, and then you have to pick a location for the roundhouse, and it was just a significant undertaking. The location he selected, in order to kind of essentially, properly house this fleet of locomotives that he had amassed, was it's in a floodplain. It's 36 acres of farmland in the middle of Sugar Creek, outside Sugar Creek, Ohio. It really was never intended to be a roundhouse property. So Phil had to be brought in, research and design of the property. And I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that, when you design a roundhouse, you have to have a turntable first and lay everything off of that turntable. So, you had to locate a turntable for that. They had to find, they went with Amish timber framers to frame out the roundhouse. So it was an incredible undertaking at a time when, in late 2000s, when most folks weren't thinking about building roundhouses, and certainly not roundhouses from the 1920s to 1940s, but roundhouses that would also then have one of the most state-of-the-art restoration shops you're going to find out there. So it was a real monumental task. And when I give tours of the roundhouse to folks as I'm there, and I'll talk to them about Jerry, and I never had the pleasure of meeting Jerry, unfortunately, just his family. But Jerry reminded me in many ways of the character from Jurassic Park, who would always tell people that he spared no expense on his park. And Jerry really went in every detail of the roundhouse, right down to the signs on the walls and the break room for the guys who work in the shop. It just really is just a wonderful, evocative space. And after having seen it and seen how much effort went into making it look that way, it was really easy for me to say this is a great place to come and tell great stories.
The challenge that's come with that is that his vision wasn't just, to draw a little bit of an analogy, if listeners are familiar with Steamtown National Historic Site, Steamtown being a former railroad property that was long story short, turned into a national park. Actually, we interviewed Debbie Conway, so you should totally check out that episode. But Noel here tells me he's heard almost every single episode. So big props to Noel for being a fan of the show as well as a guest. So unlike something like Steamtown, where it was a railroad property turned into a museum and there was kind of that mindset of public facing, the challenge that's existed with this since its inception has been how to make it authentic and how to be able to introduce people to that with all of the logistics that come with what, as I understand it, is kind of classified as a construction site of sorts.
The challenge, again, I think, when Jerry envisioned the Roundhouse, it was a place for Jerry to store his collection. And it was a private collection. Just as anybody who collects anything has private collections in their homes. The difference was Jerry collected enormous things. And things that folks have a real desire to see oftentimes. And so that was a challenge. But what attracted me to the site was the fact that the Roundhouse is a living, working roundhouse with an incredibly talented staff of restorationists and machinists who basically bring these beauties back to life for us to enjoy. And to me, that was the selling point of the Roundhouse. It harkened back to my early days in the museum business at Colonial Williamsburg, working in the Department of Historic Trades, where the trade shops at Colonial Williamsburg produced real things, real tangible things, and people got to watch them do that. And that, to me, was the real draw of the Roundhouse. That, to me, is, I think, what will be the real draw of the Roundhouse moving forward, is both a combination of the wonderful collection, the wonderful setting, and then the wonderful work that people will get to see being done. And that's a really unique experience for people.
This year, you've mapped it out, so now this is your first year of having regular public hours. So how do you strike a balance to keep that vision of it being a working roundhouse, but still being able to allow the public in a different means this time around?
One of the things we decided early on when we made the decision to open to the public was not to reinvent the wheel. That being said, that we felt like the only way we could at this point safely share what we have with people would be with a guided tour experience, so that we could keep a track of folks and keep them safe and make sure they were always, aware of what was going on around them. So when we decided to open this year, what we decided to do was essentially work on our strength. So we decided to schedule 3 public tours a day, beginning of May through the end of October. Starting Thursday, Fridays, and Saturdays. Tickets are sold online. There are a small number of tickets that are available at the door for these tours. So we're essentially taking that public tour day that you mentioned that we did in the past, and we're just expanding it to 3 days a week, 3 tours a day, so we can open the doors up to more people. This, of course, requires us to go out and seek out more volunteers to help with tours. To more paid tour guides and site interpreters to help us with the tours, to make sure that people are safe. Our staff of restoration workers is getting educated on what that means to have more people coming through the site at any given time, so that things are safe. Certain work will have to be put off on certain days in order to make sure that we do that. So we want to find that nice balance. I think, Nick, ultimately the goal is to allow visitors to visit the site on their own. I think that's the ultimate goal. But we're certainly not there yet. We're probably years away from that opportunity to have that kind of experience. But we wanted to open the doors up first because we know how interested people are both in our collection and in the site. We wanted to give people an opportunity to see it and embrace it. And we want to build those relationships with our visitors and our future visitors. And we felt like this was the easiest way to do that, was to essentially come back to what our strength was, which is very enjoyable guided tours with incredibly knowledgeable leaders and staff, and an opportunity to see real work going on.
What can people who've never experienced the Roundhouse before expect to see when they go for a visit?
Well, I think that's going to be unique for every single visitor. Our standard tour usually takes you through the entire Roundhouse. We essentially have the Roundhouse broken up, and Nick, I know you've been there, but we have the Roundhouse broken up into 2 distinct areas. There is a historic part of the Roundhouse, which houses most of our historic collection of locomotives, non-operational in some cases, but in some cases operational. There is the back shop of the roundhouse where the actual, what I always kind of say, the magic happens, where the locomotives that are currently being worked on are there to be seen, and the work going on is seen in those shops. And so any visitor taking a tour through the roundhouse is going to see both of those areas. So they're going to see essentially, almost what we consider kind of the alpha and the omega. They're going to see the locomotive in its raw form before restoration. But then they're also going to see examples of locomotives that we have completely restored or cosmetically restored. So it's an opportunity to see that. The round, one of the wonderful things about Jerry's collection is it wasn't just locomotives. Jerry collected tooling, material, artifacts of every size and shape. We will also be having changing exhibits in our exhibit room in what we call the Jacobson Gallery in the depot, where we'll have changing exhibits regularly so we can highlight different aspects of the collection, different stories that we can tell with the collection. And then depending on what's going on, there might be a locomotive out on the turntable being switched. There might be cars being switched around the yard. You just never know, because on any given day, it really is dictated by the work that's going on in the shop.
Jerry bought so many different steam locomotives with so many different stories. We couldn't possibly cover them all on here, but I have to ask, Noel, what are your particular favorites?
Oh, man. I've been there about 8 months now, and I'll tell you, I think this is my favorite, and I'll tell you why. My favorite is the Moorhead in North Fork number 12, which is one we just finished restoring this year, and which won a Heritage Rail Alliance award this year for its restoration. That one is my favorite, and my reason for that is on my second day on the job, I was allowed to drive that locomotive down the tracks on the grounds. And that was pretty amazing. And I think that has become my favorite. We have other locomotives that are fun. I enjoy. Right now we're restoring U.S. Army number 2630 for an event we're doing later this year. And I'm really beginning to enjoy that locomotive a lot because of the story that it can tell. There's always, the number 19, the Emperor of the North, which is in the back shop right now being worked on, which has a great story and has a huge fan following. So it's hard for me to narrow it down, but right now it's the 12, but it's mostly because I got to play with it.
I'll have to confess, being that I was raised on a steady diet of Canadian steam, I would probably say 1293, the 462 Pacific passenger locomotive would be mine, but there's just so many, and encapsulating different sizes, different eras of steam. It's really quite amazing. Let's talk about you, Noel. So you come from a career background of historic preservation. You mentioned working at Colonial Williamsburg. What are some of the stops that career has taken you up to this point?
Well, my interest has always been in American industrial and technological history. So starting with Colonial Williamsburg, and then working with historic farm museums, working with Historic Bethlehem in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which has a wonderful industrial history, and then spending really the last 14 years before coming to Sugar Creek with the National Watch and Clock Museum, looking at another amazing American industry of watch and clock making. So that's been my background and interest, and that was one of the things that really drew me to Sugar Creek and Age of Steam was this really amazing American industry that had such an impact both here and across the world, and the stories that we can tell with that history and with those objects that we have in our collection it's never ending. And so for museum folks, it's oftentimes the stories we can tell, and when we have good collections, it's never ending.
Given your experience with these other forms of collection and preservation, what makes this different, and what similarities do you find?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remind my staff at the Roundhouse pretty regularly that what they really are is a living history site. They're not a static museum in the way that, say, the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania is in Strasburg. They are a living, breathing, working historic site. And in many ways are making history themselves. So for me, my experience with living history, both at Colonial Williamsburg and farm museums and elsewhere, I think is the most relevant experience, because when I watch, Scotty Ziggins, he's one of our chief machinists, working on a part for one of the locomotives, and he's really doing that work. He's not pretending to do it, and he's not doing it for fun. He's doing it for a real reason, and that's a real living, breathing kind of work. And I think that is what really makes the Roundhouse unique and special, and a living history site. And I think we're going to do our best to take advantage of that aspect. And thank goodness to Jerry for designing a roundhouse that looks real and feels real when you're in it. He could have built just a standard old building to put his locomotives in and house his collection, and it could have just been a giant warehouse. But what he built was something that was it's a beautiful testament to the era of steam, and it's a beautiful backdrop for the work that the guys are doing every day.
You touched on it there. The open-ended question. Well, many open-ended questions, but one that I want to pull out from that is, what history will you create with this site? This is an interesting form of preservation. We're so used to, in this field, working with sites that have that pre-existing history. So here we have something that didn't exist until the preservation element came in. So it seems to me that there's a very wide canvas for you to paint the picture of what you do here, so that what you're doing is the history itself, because it wasn't there previously.
Right. And Nick, I think one of our responsibilities, one of the Age of Steam Roundhouse's responsibilities, and maybe anybody who does steam preservation, one of our responsibilities, I think, is to educate the modern world about the quality and the viability and the safety and the of steam locomotion in general, and it's to educate people. I think you're seeing fewer, as you know well, as much as anybody, fewer and fewer opportunities for steam locomotives to be out on the main lines. There's a fear, I think, of the industry of steam locomotives. And the liabilities that go with them, and the Union Pacific accident we saw earlier this year is a good example of that. But we as a museum, and we as a group of people who are interested in steam and its use, need to work really hard to build up these partnerships with the industry today, and educate them more and more about the quality of the work that we do, the safety that and the safety with which we can do our work. So that hopefully we can give people more of an opportunity to see these locomotives in action. One of the questions I get asked a lot about these locomotives we're restoring is, why are you bothering? What are you going to do with them? And I understand where that's coming from. We want to see the 19 out on a main line pulling something someday. We want to see our locomotives out, pulling excursion trains or doing photo excursions. We want to see that. The only way that's going to happen is if we as a group can convince the industry that we can do that safely. And I think that's something that our job as a museum and as a preservation and restoration shop, that's one of our strongest missions, I think.
There's two levels at which you could do that. There's the local/regional level with Genesee and Wyoming, because, as you said, their tracks are right outside your door. You have a connection to them physically. So there's that level, and then there's the Class 1 mainline Norfolk Southern CSX level as well.
And I think there's I wasn't knowledgeable about this at all before I started working. I've been very well educated in the last few months, but it seems a lot of times we recently have gotten very active on social media, on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and we're really trying to kind of pull the curtain back on the Roundhouse after years of having a curtain in front of it. But one of the questions that comes up all the time is, when are you going to run this train? Why don't you just run this train here? As if it's that easy to do. And there are great challenges to it that we as a hobby, if you want to even call it that, or as an industry, need to really address so that we can do that, because there is a demand to see it.
Along with that, there's the education aspect, because if excursions are going to continue into the 21st century, then it's about organizations like yours having the understanding and respect for what the perspective is from the freight companies to be able to develop relations, and then once you've developed them, to maintain them, to be able to take your toys out on the main line.
And I'm hoping, one of our goals really long term is to see our steamers out on the G&W line at some point. We would love to be able to do that. We would love to be able to partner with them and be able to demonstrate to them and to our public that what we do is wonderful and safe and will not impact on their operations at all.
Fingers crossed for you. Pretty much every rail fan listening to this podcast has their fingers crossed for you. But it's a good thing. The world is full of twists and turns as far as opportunities presenting themselves and so forth. So it's certainly, as you're demonstrating with the tours and opening up of your doors of your own facility and how you're able to balance the PR elements, the safety elements, that reflects well in the eyes of those who are the decision makers with those other entities. I
really hope so. And I would really encourage any of them to come and visit us and see the shop and see how seriously we take what we do.
What are some of the current projects that are being worked on in the back shop at this point, cosmetic restoration or operation?
We're working on two, one operational, one cosmetic at the moment. The operational is the McLeod River Railroad number 19, the Emperor of the North. She's in the back shop having her boiler rebuilt and some trailing truck work done. She should have about 3 years left on her 15-year cycle there. So we're hoping to get her working and up and at least see if we can't get her under fire here in the next couple of years. So we have time left on that. So that's something that everybody coming to the back shop gets to see. I had a nickel for everybody who was gaga about seeing the 19. I wouldn't be working at all. And we don't even do tours that much, so it tells you a lot. So that's the main real restoration project that's going back to operational status right now. The cosmetic one I mentioned is the U.S. Army 2630 locomotive. We are doing a full cosmetic restoration on that one, but we're doing it in such a way that we will hopefully be able to also potentially get it operational as well down the road if we choose to. So we're trying to make sure we put it back together in a way that all the parts are actually there to work if we want them to do it at some point. That also includes cosmetic restoration of some flat cars, some U.S. Army flat cars, some tenders that are going to be on display, some early 1940s box cars that we're going to be using for an upcoming program. So those are the two big projects right now. We actually just had a meeting the other day where we were throwing around what we wanted to work on next once we finish the Army locomotive, so that we can actually start kind of planning out the next potential.
One of the reasons I can imagine that that's a focus of restoration is because this summer you're looking to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings with a special event.
Yeah, this summer, July 5th and 6th, weather permitting, we're doing an event called Steam to Victory. We were approached by a group of local Ohio-based military vehicle collectors and reenactors who thought it would be really neat if we could do something with them to commemorate D-Day. We wanted to do something big and splashy this summer for our first tour season. And we also had this wonderful U.S. Army locomotive in the collection that really kind of deserved, the white glove treatment, and it gave us an opportunity to do that. We're really looking forward to having that out on the lines, on the tracks there at the Roundhouse for folks to take pictures of, and for people in uniform to be near, and to honor veterans of World War II and all military veterans that day and those couple of days. So it's really going to be a neat event. We'll also have the 60 through 25, I believe, out that day, as well as our Brooklyn Navy Yard switcher will be out as well for people to see and get up close to. So it'll be a neat event.
Before that one, you have your Blue Flag special.
One of the things, again, for me, one of the highlights of what we do and what I've harped on for a while is the work that goes on in the shop. And what we really wanted to try to do was give an immersive experience for visitors to come into the shop, talk to the guys who are doing the work, have real one-on-one interactions with them, maybe try their hand at some of the work that's going on in the shop. Help us fire up number 12 for that day as well. So what we figured we would just give it a kind of a try, and we put it out on our email mailing list, and it sold out in 3 hours. So we're hoping to do it again because people seem to really enjoy the idea of doing it. And for our standpoint, we really like it because it gives us an opportunity to really highlight the important part of what we do.
It's funny. It makes me think of Willy Wonka with the golden tickets, except people have to buy them. But it's that sense of like, oh, this is a really special opportunity, something brand new, and people are going to clamor for it. As soon as I saw the email, it's like, yep, those are going to sell out really fast.
Yeah, we scheduled it before our opening day, so it's really a kind of a preview tour, but a really immersive preview tour. And then we're hoping to do more of those kinds of tours in the future. We're hoping to partner with more people to do those. We really, again, my job and the job of my team now is to really pull that curtain back and let people really enjoy the Roundhouse and have it have meaning for them. In whatever way has meaning for them, whether it's because a family member was a railroader, whether it's because they've just always been fascinated with the Emperor of the North, whatever it may be, we want them to have that opportunity. Besides
those two events and the regular tours, are there any other events that you have on the radar at this point for 2019?
Well, not really particularly events as much as we're working through the exhibit schedule that we want to put on in the Roundhouse and in the depot. Our staff are putting together different ideas for how we can present the material that we have at the Roundhouse. We're hoping to perhaps do a railroad music event later in the year at the Roundhouse with traditional railroad music and open that up to the public. So there'll be a bunch of different things. We really wanted 2019 to be an easy year for us to make it sound awful, I guess, and then really push for 2020 to be our real intensive year.
I think that's a good goal because there's so much that you're doing that's new for your site. It's better to take it at a pace that you feel comfortable just so you know what your building blocks are, your foundations for being able to use the collection effectively, use the gallery effectively, how to make the most out of events and the partnerships that you want to build up with other organizations to be able to carry off those types of events. With this World War II, when you talk about partnering with a local World War II vehicle organization, that to me seems like the more that you're just introducing people and finding those ways of being able to gather additional resources through that enthusiasm, the more that's going to be possible in the long run.
And we also want our community and our neighbors to get used to the folks coming out to the Roundhouse. I think if we went too busily, made too much going on this year, it might be overwhelming for a lot of our neighbors. So we really want to kind of ease everybody, including ourselves, our staff, into what it means to be open to the public on a regular basis.
That's a good strategy. You mentioned that in the long run, some years down the way, you'd like to see being able to do mainline excursions of some kind. You'd like to be able to have open hours where people can walk wherever you're designating and not following on a specific tour. What are some of the other visions that you have as far as the possibilities with the collection and how you display it?
One of the things we want to do is we know that our visitors are all going to be coming from different backgrounds now. I mean, in the past, the Roundhouse had principally been open to railfan groups for the most part. So we are going to have a new kind of diverse audience coming through the Roundhouse that's never come through before. So we need to make sure that we're developing new programs and new tours that are targeted towards those groups. We want to make sure that we have that kind of hardcore technical tour if you are a diehard rail fan and you really want to take that really technical side of it. But then there are also folks, if you've been to I know Nick, you've been there, but there are folks who come to the Roundhouse who simply want to see the architecture of the Roundhouse. They just want to understand that. And we want to develop those tours and those special, unique opportunities for people to experience the Roundhouse in a way that means the most to them. We want to grow the museum's ability to highlight the collection, and that may mean the addition of physical space for new exhibit galleries. But we want to make sure the site always has that 1920s, 1940s Roundhouse living history feel to it. We don't want to ruin that for our visitors. And so everything that we're going to do, even with making it accessible to people, is going to be done with that in mind moving forward. we don't want people to come to the Roundhouse and obviously see modern aspects of it there all the time. We want them to get that feel that they've gone back in time when they come to the Roundhouse. So we're going to work very hard at making sure the landscape and the site plan is done. We just started a strategic planning process for the Roundhouse. We started it this year so we could identify what our greatest priorities are going to be moving forward, and where we need to make changes and where we need to improve. So building up all of that is really going to take a long time. But I remind the guys in the shop, and I remind the volunteers doing the tours, that 10 years from now, the Roundhouse is going to be very different and a wonderful, beacon for folks who are really interested in what we do. And when you consider that 10 years ago, the Roundhouse was an empty field, I don't think that's impossible.
How would you describe the team that you have working for you?
They are probably some of the most talented, technically savvy individuals I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. Chief Mechanical Officer Tim Sposato, I think, who has a wonderful reputation in the steam locomotive and in the rail industry in general. Who's worked with Ross Rowland Ross Rowland. He's worked with Ross in the past. Scott Ziggins. These guys are guys who've worked with Jerry for years on their railroads and on these locomotives. We have these young guys in the shop, Alan and Nick and others who are there every day learning from these guys, and really kind of essentially serving what I would consider an apprenticeship under some of the best people in the business. Even right down to Greg Miller, who's our rail line, who lays the rails. I mean, he's one of the best in the business at it. I mean, we really have really a top-notch, small but top-notch staff to work with to move forward with that part of the work. We're just starting to hire the museum side of it, which is a different kind of perspective, which is hiring the educators, hiring the museum store people, hiring the marketing people to handle the museum aspect of it. But what's great is we have this really incredibly good core group of people who understand the locomotives. John Corns, who's really our historian, who knows every single thing there is to know about every single locomotive in that building and every little part in it. So we have an amazing group of folks to really get started with.
In model railroading, there's often jokes, because a lot of model railroaders are guys, about, what's the wife gonna think of this, and all that type of joking. So, what does Jerry's wife think of what everything has come to now that she's getting to see all of this realization of his goals and dreams?
I think it's important to remember that we are the Jerry and Laura Jacobson Foundation. That this foundation was started by Jerry and Laura both, and that much of Jerry's and the Ohio Central success, and when he was doing excursions, was a result of Laura's hard work as well. And Laura is still a board member of the foundation, is very active, and I love it when she comes down to the Roundhouse, and when Jerry's kids come down to the Roundhouse, it's wonderful as well. So it's my hope is that we're doing Jerry proud. My hope is that when they think about that 6-year-old Jerry on that bicycle watching locomotives go by, that when they come down to the Roundhouse, they believe that 6-year-old Jerry would be happy to see what we're doing. Because really, when I think about what we're trying to do, and I remind my staff of this all the time, think about that 6-year-old Jerry. Think about what was going through that young man's mind and what really inspired everything that we're doing. And Jerry changed the lives of hundreds and hundreds of people as a result of that little dream that he had when he was a young man. And I think, I hope that when Laura comes down, that's what she sees.
You mentioned his kids. I was fortunate enough when I had my tour to be given the tour by Jay, one of his sons. And it just, his enthusiasm for what's going on there, clearly the spirit of what Jerry wanted to do lives on with his family, but it seems to be within the crew as a whole.
Yeah. The family is always going to play an integral role in the Roundhouse, both their support of what we're doing, but also their personal connection with it. It is, that was their father's place. And they have a connection to it, and they always will. And they will always be a part of our family at the Roundhouse.
At the end of the day, Noel, when you look at the work that you're accomplishing here and the growth that's occurred over the years, even beforehand, but now that you get to be a part of, what makes you most happy about your job?
What makes me most happy about my job is watching the transition from a kind of insular place to a place where people can share it. To listen and watching some of the guys in the shop when they get to share what they're doing with people, because for years it's been kind of behind that fence, and now we're really taking that curtain down. And for me, that's the highlight is listening to them tell people what they're doing, share what they're doing with the world. When for a long time, I don't know that they could do that.
It's going to be incredible to continue to watch this unfold, and the types of events you can do, the types of partnerships you're going to be able to form. It's really exciting times. You've got to check these guys out if you haven't already. They're on Facebook, Twitter, ageofsteamroundhouse.org. You have to, if you've never heard of this place before, you have to go to the website. If you've heard of it and you're as excited as you think you are about seeing it, you really should be, and you should definitely make a point to go visit there during one of their open houses or during one of their tours. Thank you so much for joining us on the Roundhouse today, Noel, to talk about the Roundhouse and the collection and everything that you have growing there. It's really great to see this transformation, and there's some really good things in the future I can see.
It was my pleasure, Nick. Thanks so much for having me.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking to Scott Lodes, the president and executive director of the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, which brought about the interesting question, what is your favorite form of railroad art? And there's a lot of different ways you can interpret this. From Twitter, Tim Bancroft writes, "Live if it is steam. I call it art in motion." And Ian Wilson writes, "A well-written book." Loads to choose from on both fronts. And from Facebook, Zach Reitmeyer writes, "Music. Lyrics about locomotives roaring through the jungle or magic carpets made of steel can paint some pretty powerful imagery." Cayenne adds, "Oh, Winston Lake." I think that's a pretty strong contender for defining railroad art for sure. For your question of the day for this episode, go to the Age of Steam Roundhouse website, look at all the steam locomotives they have, and then tell me, what is your favorite steam locomotive in their collection? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. We have links to social media. Also, if you think Meadville Railroad Depot sounds like a good project, saving a 140-year-old station, or nearly 140 years, depending on when you're listening to this, that is the place to go, and we really appreciate the support. Thank you guys for listening, and remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.